My mom commanded me to hand my son's college savings to my brother's Yale-bound genius. She set it across my dining room table as if she were assigning someone to pass the salt. The late afternoon sun poured through the window, lighting up the stack of bank statements in front of me. Every deposit represented overtime shifts, skipped vacations, and years of sacrifice. My son Ethan sat quietly beside me, only 16 at the time, pretending to focus on his homework while listening to every word.
"Your boy will never need it," my brother Daniel said with a laugh.
Let's be realistic. Ryan's headed to Yale. Ethan will probably end up fixing lawnmowers or stocking shelves. The room exploded with chuckles. Even my mother smiled. I remember the sound of the clock ticking on the wall and the heat rising in my chest. What hurt wasn't the money they wanted, it was how easily they dismissed my son, as if his future had already been decided. Ethan heard every word, and he never forgot them. I'm the middle child in a family that always measured worth by trophies, prestigious schools, and public praise. My older brother Daniel fit that mold perfectly. He was charismatic, loud, and skilled at turning every achievement into a performance. Growing up, my mother treated him like proof that our family was special. I was different. I worked quietly, paid my bills on time, and built a stable life without needing applause. Somehow that made me invisible. When Daniel lost jobs, my mother called him misunderstood. When I worked 60-hour weeks to support my family, she called it ordinary. The pattern never changed. My wife noticed it long before I did. She used to squeeze my hand under the table during family dinners whenever conversations drifted toward Daniel's latest accomplishment, while my own milestones went unnoticed. Then our sons were born. Ryan became the next family prodigy before he could even spell his own name. Every good grade became family news. Every soccer trophy earned a place of honor on my mother's mantle. My son Ethan received no such attention. He was thoughtful, patient, and endlessly curious. He spent hours taking apart broken electronics just to understand how they worked. Yet relatives described him with words like average and quiet. They mistook silence for lack of potential. The more they overlooked him, the more determined he became to prove that they were looking in the wrong direction. The request for Ethan's college fund wasn't an isolated moment. It was simply the most blatant example of something that had been happening for years. At family gatherings, I began noticing the small things I had once ignored. When Ethan talked about a science project, conversations drifted elsewhere before he finished his sentence. When Ryan mentioned a competition he planned to enter, everyone leaned forward as if listening to a future president. The differences were subtle enough to deny, yet impossible to miss. One Thanksgiving, Ethan brought a homemade drone he had built from spare parts. He carefully placed it on the table, hoping to show everyone how it worked. My mother glanced at it for barely a second. Then she turned to Ryan and asked about his college prep classes. The drone sat untouched for the rest of the evening. I watched Ethan quietly carry it back to the car after dinner. He never complained. That somehow made it worse. Daniel's comments grew sharper as the years passed. "Still spending money on those little gadgets?" he asked once, swirling ice in his glass. Another time he smiled and said, "Not everyone is meant for big things." The room would fall silent for a moment before someone changed the subject. Nobody defended Ethan. Nobody needed to raise their voice. The damage came from the casual certainty in their faces, the assumption that his story had already been written, while Ryan's future was destined for greatness. Even then, I had a feeling they were making a very expensive mistake. The turning point arrived during Ethan's senior year of high school. By then, Ryan had become the centerpiece of every family conversation. Acceptance letters, scholarships, interviews my mother discussed. Each update as though the entire family had invested in his success. Then one Sunday afternoon, Daniel called. For the first time, his confidence sounded strained. Ryan had been accepted to several good universities, but not Yale. Worse, the scholarships they expected never fully materialized. Tuition costs were becoming a serious problem. A week later, my mother appeared at my front door. She wasn't asking anymore. She was assuming the money should stay in the family, she said calmly, referring to Ethan's college fund. Ryan can do something extraordinary with it. I looked past her and saw Ethan through the living room window. He was bent over a workbench, studying aircraft diagrams spread across the table. Something became crystal clear in that moment. Nobody in my family had ever doubted Ethan because of his abilities. They doubted him because they had never bothered to look closely. For years, I had remained silent to keep the peace. I had accepted every dismissal, every comparison, every insult disguised as advice. That day, I finally understood that protecting peace and protecting my son were no longer the same thing. I told my mother no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just once, firmly and completely. The look on her face told me she had never imagined hearing that word from me. And from that moment forward, everything began to change. After that conversation, I stopped trying to convince anyone that Ethan deserved respect. Arguments would not change their minds. Evidence would, so I focused entirely on helping my son build the future they insisted he could never have. Over the next 2 years, Ethan devoted himself to aviation and engineering. He earned top grades, completed advanced certification programs, and spent weekends volunteering at a small regional airport. While other teenagers chased attention, he chased experience. I handled the practical side. As an accountant, I had spent years managing budgets, contracts, and long-term financial planning. I reviewed every scholarship opportunity, researched aviation academies, and made sure the college fund remained legally protected and inaccessible to outside pressure. Meanwhile, Daniel made a series of increasingly risky decisions. Convinced Ryan's success was guaranteed, he borrowed money against future expectations. Expensive private tutoring, prestige programs, and lifestyle upgrades consumed far more than he could comfortably afford. I never interfered. I never offered criticism. I simply watched. Ethan, on the other hand, kept moving forward one step at a time. He earned scholarships through merit, built relationships with flight instructors, and completed every requirement with quiet determination. Family members rarely asked about his progress. That suited us perfectly. The less attention Ethan received, the more freedom he had to grow without expectations or pressure. By the time the rest of the family realized how far he had come, the outcome was already set in motion. They just didn't know it yet. 5 years later, our family reunion was being held at a large countryside resort. By then, life had taken an unexpected turn. Daniel's financial gambles had collapsed. Mounting debt, failed investments, and years of living beyond his means had eventually cost him almost everything. Ryan, burdened by his own setbacks, struggled to find stable footing after graduation. The family arrived that afternoon carrying an uncomfortable silence nobody wanted to discuss. Then a distant sound rolled across the open fields. At first it was faint, a low rhythmic thump. Conversation stopped. Heads turned upward. A helicopter appeared over the tree line, descending slowly toward a designated landing area near the resort grounds. The rotor wash scattered, dust and loose leaves across the grass as relatives shielded their eyes. When the aircraft settled, the pilot stepped out. Ethan. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The same boy they had dismissed as ordinary stood, there in a professional flight uniform, calm and confident, as if landing helicopters at family gatherings was the most normal thing in the world. I glanced at my mother. She looked stunned. Daniel looked away. Ethan greeted everyone politely, never mentioning the past. Then he walked directly toward his cousin Ryan and handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a job offer, not charity, not pity, a real position with the aviation company Ethan now helped manage. The room fell silent again. Years earlier, they had tried to take his future. Now he was quietly offering someone else a second chance. That silence was louder than any revenge speech could have been. Nobody rushed to speak after Ryan finished reading the letter. The weight of the moment seemed to settle over the entire reunion. My mother sat down slowly, staring at Ethan as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time. The pride she had once reserved exclusively for Ryan now mixed with something far less comfortable regret. Daniel looked older than I remembered. For years, he had measured people by potential he could brag about. Now he was forced to confront a reality he couldn't explain away. The son he had mocked had become successful through discipline, patience, and persistence. The son he had placed on a pedestal was being offered a lifeline by the very cousin he had been taught to look down on. What surprised me most was Ryan's reaction. There was no anger, no wounded pride. He simply walked over to Ethan and shook his hand. It was the first honest interaction I had ever seen between them. Around us, relatives exchanged uneasy glances. Reputations built on assumptions were quietly unraveling. Nobody could pretend they had supported Ethan all along. And that is why this story matters. Most people will never face a betrayal dramatic enough to make headlines. Instead, they face smaller wounds, being underestimated, ignored, or told their limits by people who never truly see them. Those judgments can shape lives if we accept them. Ethan didn't. He let his actions answer every prediction made about him. In the end, the people who underestimated him had to live with the consequences of being wrong. Driving home from the reunion, I thought about how differently I would have handled everything years earlier. Back then, I believed respect could be earned by working harder, staying quieter, and giving people more chances to appreciate you. I spent far too much energy trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. Age taught me something simpler. You do not need everyone to recognize your value for it to exist. The greatest satisfaction was never watching my family realize they were wrong. It was watching Ethan become the man he was always capable of becoming, untouched by their opinions. In the months that followed, relationships slowly changed. My mother made genuine efforts to reconnect with Ethan. Daniel, humbled by his circumstances, became less concerned with appearances and more willing to listen. Some wounds healed. Others remained as quiet reminders of the past. As for Ethan, he continued building his career, mentoring young pilots, and helping others find opportunities that he once had to fight for himself. And Ryan accepted the job. The rivalry everyone expected never existed. What replaced it was something far more valuable: mutual respect. Looking back, I realize revenge was never the helicopter landing, the success, or the stunned silence. The real revenge was that they tried to define my son's future and failed. Because the people who truly rise aren't the ones who are praised the loudest. They're the ones who keep climbing long after everyone else stops looking.